Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. I'm Gene Paranek. Today, Friday, December 2nd. We made it all the way to December. It's so good to be with you. Today, as always, local and national events. Then, one item of FDA news before our main event today. I am joined in studio today by Dr. Philip Hessburg, who is the medical director of the Detroit Institute of Ophthalmology, but it goes way beyond that. What he's done for innovation and also revolutionizing the nexus between eyesight, cognition, transportation, medical technologies, all coming together. We're going to have a really fun conversation coming up in just a few minutes. But first of all, I want to tell you about the local and national events in the ecosystem. December 6th of this year, the FDA's Broad Agency Announcement Day. FDA is looking to partner with industry and researchers on their initiatives to further regulatory science. And that Broad Agency Announcement is out. They're going to have their event virtually on December 6th. If you're interested in partnering with FDA, scan that QR code. Also on December 6th, and I'm going to be at this, in Massachusetts, Dr. Jeff Shuren is going to be keynoting the regulatory roundup being put on by Mass Medic. That's an in-person event with a virtual option. You can scan the QR code to get associated with that. But it also turns out they're going to be covering much more than just Dr. Shuren's comments. There's going to be all sorts of educational elements to that as well. Good to have the FDA back in person. Then on December 5th through 7th, the Digital Transformation Symposium, this also put on by FDA, talking about their strategic vision for using data, cloud, user experience data, cybersecurity, and further. That's going to be on the 5th through 7th. It's actually a multi-day virtual conference. Scan the QR code. December 7th and 8th, and this is one that I'm personally really passionate about, another FDA event. It's the Clinical Investigator Training course. And of course, as you've heard us say before, that junction between academic research and actual commercial research that can be cleared by the agency, usually a really big gap. This course designed to teach folks how to write clinical trials that FDA is likely to accept. So the CITC course coming up on December 7th and 8th, coming up fast later next week. Then again on December 8th, coming back locally, the Biomixer, sponsored by Mish Bio, is being hosted by our friends over at C2DX. They're in Schoolcraft, Michigan, but it's a great place for the community to gather, where they are going to be having the Biomixer over in Schoolcraft, Michigan. Also, the Biosocial, this one also put on by Mish Bio, Ann Arbor Spark, and My Lead Consulting at Pretzel Bell, back to their roots. This is a place where the Southeast Michigan biosciences community gets together frequently. That's happening Tuesday, December 13th at 5 p.m. at Pretzel Bell. Then on January 16th, we're breaking into 2023. Can you believe it? The Innovation Award, COVID-19 and Health Equity. There's a number of places where different communities are underserved. Experience with COVID-19 has been one of those. The FDA is looking to fund, it's only about 4 proposals to the tune of about $2 million total. And they're making innovation awards, but the applications are due January 16th. There's a lot more nuance behind that. But if you think you have something to say about health equity, especially as it relates to COVID-19 and ways that innovations can be leveraged, that would be a good one to check out. Then on January 23rd and 24th, the Social Determinants of Health Summit. If you remember listening to some of the MedHealth interviews that we've been showing you over the last few weeks, the social impact or the demographics that enter into the actual delivery of healthcare, it's gigantic. And this conference is going to be in January in San Diego at the Marriott Marquis San Diego. January 31st of next year, our friends at MedTech Innovator, both in medical technology, biotechnology, and in specifically the Asia Pacific market as well, are having their program deadlines. That's a great accelerator. Diane Bowie was just on the show, and you can find out more about what they're doing through that QR code right there. Also in January and February next year, our friends over at the University of Michigan are running their Biomedical Innovation 101 webinar series. They're going to be talking about everything from intro to research commercialization all the way through next steps. And in between, they're going to talk about drug discovery, diagnostic technologies, digital health, and biomedical device development. Our own Adrian Harris is going to be part of one of those panels, and we're looking forward to that whole series. They're giving back to the community, talking about how to do translation. And then we wanted you to know, coming up November 14th and 16th, 14th through 16th of next year, the Combination Products Summit is already back on the calendar for next year. There's an AI summit. There's a Combination Product Summit. Cleveland is coming back. They are doing what seemed to be the pickup of the old Xavier conferences, but it is sure good to see those coming back to Cleveland. And then this bridges into our big event today. I want to tell you for the first time about October 8th through 10th, 2023. We'll be telling you more about this in just a minute, but the next installment of this, the Eye and the Chip World Congress on Artificial Vision. You can scan the QR code there if you want to get connected to this, but you're going to hear a whole lot more about it in just a few minutes. That is one of two congresses that we'll be telling you about shortly, talking about this nexus between seeing and microprocessing. Like, how do we compute things with regard to what we see? But it goes way beyond that. There's more that we'll tell you about here in just a second with Dr. Hessburg. But first, we're going to do one news item. And this, from the FDA fresh this week. FDA has released a number of medical device development tools. And if that sounds good, I think it actually is. The one this week is called the Chemical Risk Calculator, affectionately known as CRIS. Well, it's all about color additives. And if that sounds pretty boring, it's actually not, because first of all, here's what an MDDT is. The program is a way for FDA to qualify tools that medical device sponsors, that's the companies that are putting the devices on the market, can choose to use in the development and evaluation of medical devices. So in other words, FDA is trying to recognize tools that would accelerate the development of certain aspects of devices. They want to advance innovation. They want to increase predictability for sponsors. They want to improve efficiency and transparency. They want to encourage collaboration. All great and lofty goals, but how do they actually do that? And I think there's something to this. Let's look at CRIS, as they call it, the Chemical Risk Calculator. For color additives, well, who cares, frankly? Why would anyone care? Why would it matter? If you've heard us on the show before, you know that things as simple as composition changes of medical devices can require biocompatibility retesting. And if that doesn't sound like a big deal, well, that can take 4 to 6 months sometimes, especially if, like these days, the third-party test labs are busy. And the question is, do you want to spend another $30,000 in 4 months to change the color of your product? If you ask your stakeholders, the answer is probably not. But what if it's necessary for some reason? That's where CRIS comes in. Because what if you could computationally validate the color additive change knowing the base polymer of your product? That's really what they're trying to do, is for limited circumstances, give companies freedom to make changes without actually running the tests in a lab. The objective, they said, for CRIS is to provide assessments that are protective, not predictive. In other words, this isn't a research tool. This isn't going to give you the right answer. This is going to give you a safe answer. So when the decision comes around that it's time to change the color of the product, you can do it quickly. To accomplish this, they say, orders of magnitude of conservatism have been built into the assessment. So it turns out that if you know the color additive you want to change to and the base polymer of your device, FDA is now saying there's a way to do that through computation. And that's pretty cool. Here's a screenshot of the chemical risk calculator in action. And if you'd like to know more about this or any other medical device development tool that FDA has been clearing, you can click on that QR code right there. But it's always good to see them innovating. And speaking of innovation, I am so honored to have in studio with us today, in the flesh, Dr. Philip Hessburg, who is the medical director of the Detroit Institute of Ophthalmology, the founder of the Eye and the Chip World Research Congress, and the Eye and the Brain and the Auto World Research Congress. Dr. Hessburg, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Well, we are honored and so good to be in person after all this time remote. From the time that we met through Dr. Philip Ola, who's been on the show before, I have been impressed time and time again, and just increasingly. You're a person who could, over the course of your career, stuck in there and just turned the crank. You could have just done the thing that you were originally trained for. But you've followed your nose, and we're going to talk about this today. You've discovered things that I don't think most people would have ever encountered. And as a result, you're now sort of sitting on the cusp of all of this nexus of innovation. Ophthalmology, cognition, transportation, microprocessing, sensors. Did you think that this is where your career would take you?
No, not really. I'm an eye surgeon, but when I was at the Ford Hospital in the years gone by, I had a research laboratory. And when I left the Ford Hospital in 1972, a group of laymen started the Detroit Institute of Ophthalmology. And when we started it, we had always held out for a research program. We had very active educational programs, but we wanted to be back into research. However, we didn't have the initial funding to jump into what I was at Ford Hospital. It would have taken electron microscopes and PhDs, and we didn't have those, so we decided on a research congress. We did not invent the research congress. They were invented in Florida by Dr. Welsh. They were called the Welsh Cataract Congresses. What happened after World War II was that a surgeon in England, Dr. Harold Ridley, was doing a cataract operation, which is the removal of the lens of the eye, which has become cloudy. And an intern looked over his shoulder and said, Mr. Ridley, you've taken out this man's lens. Why don't you put something back in? That's a really interesting question. And so Harold Ridley thought about it for a while, and he decided to carve a replacement lens out of lucite. The British had used lucite, what we call lucite, PMMA, in the windshields of fighter planes. And Harold Ridley had seen several of those pilots who had pieces of that material inside of their eye, which was being well tolerated. And so he decided to carve a lens out of polymethyl methacrylate, and he carved it the same size as the original lens, not taking into consideration the difference in the weight of the lens of the eye and PMMA. And so the first dozen or so people that had it, the vast majority of them had terrible results. But there were 3 who had the recovery of what was normal vision.
Wow.
And so it was an amazing step forward, and immediately people in Europe began studying it, people in Russia began studying it, and we in the United States decided that we wanted to study it. However, what happened was our own organizations were very opposed to it because the results in Europe had been so bad. But what happened was the American popular press heard about it, and they began writing articles about intraocular lenses. And that caused a group of young investigators to think maybe it could be done better. And those investigators who had developed an implant began to meet in a research congress in which the model blossomed under Doug Koch and Jared Emery in the South. And the model was to give an investigator who had developed an intraocular lens model 20 minutes to present his work, and this was to be followed by a 10-minute challenge period. So that if you're in a room that's totally full of people who are working in this field, and you give that audience 10 minutes as a challenge period, it's amazing how much comes forth.
They get right to the point.
There's blood on the floor. It really can be, it can be challenging. So when the Detroit Institute of Ophthalmology looked for research projects, we wanted to use that model, but we didn't know which silo in medicine we wanted to follow. So what we did was we began looking at the literature, and we developed a list of about a dozen different areas that might lend themselves to this kind of work. One of them was tinkering around with intraocular lenses. The intraocular lens was invented by Harold Lidley. All the rest of us who played around with it were really tinkerers. So what we decided to do was to use that model, and we took the dozen silos of interest, and we boiled it down to about 4. And then we began a study of the literature. And by studying the literature, we could discern the community investigators who might be interested in each of those silos. In the area of nanoelectronic visual neuroprosthetics, nanoelectronic visual neuroprosthetics, the leading authority in the world was and still is Joseph Rizzo from Harvard Medical School. And after we had put together a bibliography of 20 investigators around the world, we went to Boston and sat down with Joe Rizzo and asked him if he would co-organize a research congress. And the first one we had representatives of half a dozen countries. Now, at the Eye and the Chip in 2020, we had representatives of about 50 different laboratories tinkering with different chips. Okay? And the idea is to develop a chip to implant either in the retina or in the visual cortex of the brain. There were some charlatans early in that field which lent a bad flavor to the work. Ultimately, the people in the Eye and the Chip Congress really got past that, and that community has become very active in advancing the concept of such a device either in the eye or in the brain.
It strikes me that the origins of that come from a Congress that was not wildly theoretical. You had people who were actually doing these implants. They were trying their best. This was actually not just leading edge research in a theoretical sense, but it was applied research because these were actually being done at the time.
You mean the intraocular lens?
The intraocular lens one.
Don't forget, at that time the FDA only looked at pharmaceuticals. So those of us who were tinkering around with Harold Ridley's original idea, we didn't have all the niceties of FDA regulation. In fact, our own American Academy of Ophthalmology would not let us present papers on it. So, in effect, it was richly frowned upon that an organization, the American Intraocular Society, grew out of that group of tinkerers, and that eventually became the American Society of Cataract and Refractive Surgery, and eventually the American Academy of Ophthalmology, because the people of the United States decided we don't like cataract glasses and we want implants. If I give you a pair of cataract glasses, in other words, take the lenses out of your eye and put them into glass in front of you, the image that you looked at is 1/3 larger than normal, and your peripheral vision is cut down by 1/3.
Oh, wow.
So if we take out the lenses and put the cataract correction into a pair of glasses, we make you a visual cripple. Okay? And so
But that was the standard.
That was the standard. It had been for 200 years. And the American public decided, hey man, we don't want that. And so those of us who were fooling around with intraocular lens implants, although we were, I wouldn't say held in disgrace, I guess I would, we were very quick to see what other guys had done that hadn't worked. Okay? The Germans had used haptics made out of nylon, which dissolves inside the eye. A bad mistake.
Oh my goodness.
Okay? And the Russians had built implants which, on the face of it, we thought were ridiculous. The Low Countries in Europe had developed implants which they sewed onto the iris of the eye. Well, that's like you buying a painting and then hanging on the curtains in your living room. That doesn't make sense. And so those of us who were fooling around kept looking for safer and safer ways to do it, but it was really we'll try this week, and a couple of weeks later we'll try something else.
To see what works and navigate our way through. I mean, and knowing how the FDA is, we work with the FDA, and I imagine even then, you say, oh, I'm going to implant something in there, and oh, by the way, my data is a lucite flying out of the window of a bomber into somebody's eye, and I think it should work. How did you said there was a public uprising around? We want to be able to try this. We want to be able to move in this direction. Take us through that process, and the reason I asked this, Dr. Hessburg, is there's so many in our community who bump into the FDA. And sometimes the answer is, this is cut and dried. This is just the way it is. You either get in the bucket or you don't do whatever it is you're trying to do. But there's other times when people feel like they're on the cusp of something big enough that it could change the landscape. And you've experienced that.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the FDA. The FDA certainly in the field of ophthalmology learned its lesson with intraocular lenses. And we're at the stage now with the FDA. We have been through hearings in Washington relative to intraocular lenses. We fought battles with the FDA. What we know now is that the wisest course is to begin discussions with the FDA about the time that you're sitting in church and have the idea. The earlier that you can let it be known, this is what we're thinking of, the better off you're going to be. When it came to the development of devices for the blind, that is, chips to be implanted in the eye, our reception at the FDA was entirely different. So if you look at the eye and the chip in the year, when we were ginning up in 1999.
Because the conferences started in 2000, I think, right?
Yeah, it would be 1999. We had the FDA at the very first meeting we had, and we involved them, and we had them comment on papers that were given, and they played a crucial role in the advances that we made. So that I hear at meetings, the FDA this, the FDA that. I think that we're blessed with the FDA. I think that interfacing with them early on is crucial, and that I think that it's worth listening to them. In the development of the retinal devices, we haven't always agreed with them, and now much of the work is moving to the visual cortex of the brain, and that's a big move away from the retina. But its time is here to do that, and the FDA has been nothing but approving.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I can't say anything bad. I can tell you a lot about the horror stories of the FDA. That's a bygone era.
Yeah,
But
they've certainly
this
been
is-
trying. I think one of the things that oftentimes people don't recognize about the agency is they get exposed to so many ideas and to so many new ideas and technologies and stuff that they want to know what's happening so that they can be educated. And if you take part in that process by inviting them to something early, like a Congress where the thing hasn't even been done yet, but you're talking about it, right? That's an amazing opportunity for them as well.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, take us. I want to go. Oh, actually, one more question on FDA, if I might. As you've watched over the years, getting FDA on board with these really novel, innovative, and I mean, we're working with the eye, right? This is not completely without risk, so it's a focus for them. What has moved the needle with them? Are there any aha moments where maybe a clinician said something or a bit of research came out and it moved the needle for them and you watched it and you went, that made a difference?
Well, surely the place that we're now at with visual neuroprosthetics is that we have proof of principle that we can create devices which take photons of light and display it on an electronic plate on the inside of the eye, which will send messages to the brain. Wow. We're not at the place where the visual reward is sufficient to make the average blind person happy with the result. So the proof of principle is there. We know we can do that.
We can make you see something, but we're not replacing your
That's right.
sight yet.
We can make you see something which to many people is like a grid of flashing lights, so that you can see that grid of flashing lights is an E, all right? But it's not what the average person, at least at this stage, hopes he'll get out of it. If I'm a young blind man, blind from retinitis pigmentosa, and I decide to have an implant placed in the eye, you can talk all day long to him about what the results are going to be, but what he hears in his brain is, I'm going to be able to see my baby's face, I'm going to be able to drive, I'm going to be able to read. And that isn't where we are yet. So we have 50 or more active research projects going on around the world. Last behind the chip, we had 13 countries represented, especially the Australians, the British, the Germans, the Israelis, the Americans, all working, first of all, to do two things. First of all, we have to have better electronic devices. The chips we have, they're very, very small, they're very, very delicate, but when you compare them to the rods and the cones of the retina, they're way too big, okay? And not only that, but the input of electricity we put in is entirely different than the input of electricity that the rods and the cones are putting out naturally. So the second thing we have to understand is that equation. That is, your retina is a piece of the brain out on a stalk. Okay? So when we look at the retina, we're really looking at the neural tissues of the brain. And we don't understand that as well as we will someday. And we have a whole group of people now working what is called neural coding. Neural coding means How does these cells talk to these cells? And we don't own that yet.
Don't fully understand that. Well, that brings us to something that was just absolutely fascinating for me when you say that the eye is part of the brain, not something separate from it. Your work, and I want to come back to the congresses themselves in
Sure.
a minute, and I want to talk about sort of community and how you've developed this community over the years. But one of the most impactful things to me was this idea that we think of the eye and visual acuity as being a metric for things like safety. We're driving cars and we say, well, how good is your eyesight? Your research has been overturning the idea that that is the be-all and end-all of doing evaluations.
We'll talk a little about vision and driving. Every ophthalmologist in the world becomes discouraged when he sees a middle-aged person, elderly person whose vision drops below the acceptable guidelines of the state, no matter what state you are. And we know that they're going to go to the Secretary of State and have their license denied. And in denying the license, what we're doing is we're saying to this lady, all right, you are no longer an independent person. You are now dependent. You're going to have your daughter take you to Kroger's. When you go to want to go to Mass at St. Clair, call your daughter. When you want to get your hair done, maybe your son's going to be free. But you take a lady who is totally independent and make her dependent. That's not a funny thing. That means now we've got a lady who's depressed. She's stuck in a room looking at the wall, and all of a sudden everything aches. I have a problem with my elbow, and because they have nothing else to think about. So for my entire career in ophthalmology, which is a very long time, I have been saddened by the fact that we take independent people and we make them into cripples based on guidelines for visual acuity, which have no basis in data. In the 100 years ago, the 1920s, people got together and said, gee, we've got all these cars. Who should we let drive them? Okay, so one guy, I suppose in the back row, said, blind people shouldn't drive. Well, I guess that makes sense, right? And so they decided, okay, well, where should we let them drive? Without any data, they created these numbers.
Wow.
And so with these numbers, we've been working ever since. And every state just about has essentially the same, let's say, the same set of numbers, which aren't related in any way to highway deaths. Highway deaths are not caused by people with reduced vision.
Wow.
They're caused by 19-year-old boys who've been drinking and driving too fast.
And we sort of think about, if you put it in terms of chemical impairment,
Right.
we get it, right? We understand that this is something we shouldn't be doing.
In the eye and the auto, we just gave the Bartimaeus Award, which is an award that Roseanne Horn and our group give every year to a leading investigator at one of these congresses. The eye and the chip one year, the eye, the brain, and the auto the next. This year it went to Teivo Turvo, a researcher in Finland. The interesting thing is that Teivo Turvo, a very long time ago, came to the conclusion that visual acuity doesn't have much to do with crashes. Okay, so here's an ophthalmologist in Finland thinking the same way that we're thinking at the Ford Hospital.
Wow.
And what did he do? He decided to go to the government and create an initiative in which they reviewed the health status and the post-mortem condition of anybody killed on Finnish highway. Now think of that for a minute. This is a guy who for a couple of decades has been collecting the data on people killed on the highway. And so if you say to him, what causes people to die on the highway? Okay? You find some things that are very, very interesting. Less than 2%. In fact, during the Congress this time, we pinned him down. Probably less than 1.5% have anything to do with sight.
Wow.
And that's the only thing that you're going to be tested for. So cognition, whether the person is mentally, is cognitively crippled, or whether or not the person has a whole set of other frailties, they mean nothing. We don't test for them. So what we do is we take an awful lot of people and we make them into visual cripples.
Wow. Your eye test is suddenly the start of your mental health problem.
What Tivo Turbo has found out, that one of the interesting things is what a big role suicide plays in deaths on the highway.
Wow. There's so many things that are caused by other factors other than what you could see out
That's right.
your eyes. And it's so interesting because we do get that. We say don't drink and drive. We say don't take drugs and drive. And yet, if there's other things impairing cognition, we're not necessarily thinking about that today.
You had Philip Ola at the Congress this year, and his work is very interesting. He's analyzing the expired breath of drivers. Now, if I go to Greg Honor at Wayne State University and say to Greg, can you give me a rough idea of the blood levels of sugar in a diabetic driving by their expired air? He'll say, yeah, we can do that. Okay, well, what that means is that if that's the case, then we ought to be able to say this diabetic driver is headed for diabetic coma or insulin shock. All right? There's another interesting one. We know that there are some dogs that are able to perceive that a patient with grand mal epilepsy is going to have a seizure. All right? Well, what does that mean? That means that now we don't let those people drive. But if there is a way in which the expired air, if the dog can figure it out, there's something in the expired air that's coming forth from the neural centers of the brain, which say, hey man, there's so much activity here in the brain that we're going to have a seizure. If that's the case, then the vehicle ought to take over control of itself and pull off the highway.
And of course, if that sounds like science fiction, we already have cars today that if it detects too much motion in a weird way, it's going to say, hey, did you get enough sleep kind of thing, or do you need a coffee? I've seen rental cars where the cup of coffee pops up on the screen and says, are you getting tired?
Sure.
So we're not actually that, if that sounds like science fiction to anybody, we're not actually that far from that, even in what we're trying to do in cars today.
No, we've got somewhere, but depending on the way you break down the silos of capture, biometric data capture, we've got somewhere between 13 and 17 different parameters. For instance, it's very easy. Pulse, we've been able to take a pulse from the seat of your car for 20 years. Okay, we know we can calculate the changes in your facial color, whether all of a sudden you blanch or whether all of a sudden you're hyperemic. Something's going on. We can tell from the pulse, okay, this patient's going into cardiac arrhythmia. Well, maybe he goes into cardiac arrhythmia 10 times a day. Or maybe this cardiac arrhythmia says he's going to die. Okay. So that brings up the relationship between your medical record, okay,
yep, there we go,
and your vehicle. And because of HIPAA rules...
Because this would be better. If we knew the person's medical record, we could more clearly use an indicator to predict that something was about to happen.
Or what to do about it.
Or what to do about it.
And the what to do about it is crucial, because if I say to you, okay, you are going to have this happen, the vehicle, if it knows your medical record, can say, okay, with GPS systems and knowing what the capabilities are of various healthcare facilities, can say, okay, we can take this person to small town, hospital, or this is something that's got to go to the University of Michigan or to downtown Henry Ford, where there's a very active neurosurgical program. So that's the world we're coming to, is where your vehicle becomes a rolling medical record influenced by the biometric data that we capture in the cab.
And of course, that just opens up a whole can of worms, because now we have this interplay where the safety of the vehicle isn't really a medical issue, but it's those medical records that are going to give you the information and the access to be able to do things.
And peculiarly enough, right here in Ann Arbor, is a young woman named Jennifer Dukarski, who's now at Butzel, the law firm Butzel, who spent 20 years as an engineer in the auto industry. And after that went to law school, and now is the leading American investigator on the relationship between the biometric data that your vehicle captures, the privacy laws of the government relative to medical data, and what your car can and can't do with that data. So, so she has been at, I guess, the last four versions of the eye, the brain, and the auto. A marvelous resource.
You've got people like, it was Jennifer, right?
Yes.
You got people like Jennifer there. You've got researchers. You've invited the FDA to these kinds of events. What is the demographic that comes to these congresses and the?
In the eye and the chip, it's fairly narrow. It's the people interested in artificial vision who wish to meld nanoelectronics with neurobiology. At the eye, and because of that, you have in the room entrepreneurs interested in it, you have lawyers interested in it, you have manufacturers interested in it, you have lay people interested in it, you have some blind representatives. But that's a fairly narrow one. When it comes to the eye, the brain, and the auto, it's a much more Catholic with a small c audience. So it's going to be people who are driving specialists. It's going to be people like Robert Huss from West Virginia, who's a world expert in bioptics, which is us putting a very small diameter telescope in the corner of your glasses. It's a fraud in a way, because what it does is it lets you go to the Secretary of State's office, cock your head in just the right way, and read the letters, okay?
Wow.
But you can't drive that way. You drive with the carrier part of the lens, which may be 2200 or legal blindness. And yet those patients do wonderfully well.
Wow, that's amazing. And so the eye and the chip is very much the output of that. When those things finally make it into people, those will be medical devices. Those are vision restoring devices.
Right.
It's in this eye, the chip, and the auto where you've got this sort of interesting interplay, whether it's the regulatory or the medical or the social or the payer aspects that all just, this must be quite a bit of soup that you're trying to sort out.
Yeah, it is. And if you look at it, you'll notice there's a very big difference between the presenters of the eye and the chip and the presenters of the eye, the brain, and the auto. The way you put together a Congress like this, you've asked me this privately, is at least the way we did it, was we collected all the literature, boiled it down to 4 different silos that we were interested in, then collected literature in it. And every time we looked at the literature relative to the eye and the auto, which is what we initially called it, the name Cynthia Owsley came up. Cynthia Owsley is a PhD at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and she is recognized world over as the leading authority on the relationship between vision and driving. So we went down to Birmingham and we said, Cynthia, Dr. Owsley, if we put this together, would you co-organize it with us? We, as this tiny little DIO, we don't have world knowledge of who the leaders are, but after 20 years we do. I guess we could probably put one on without Cynthia Owsley today, but I never would have. In fact, she just helped us a couple of weeks ago. We would never try it without her.
So you're looking for those adjacencies. You're saying, well, this is kind of what I want to do. Who is the next adjacent person to this who makes the most sense?
Who can I talk to who knows more about this than anybody else in the world? And then initially, Dr. Owsley, here are 50 different investigators in this field. Pick out 20 to 30 of those that you want us to invite. And she can go down that list. Boop, 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 boop. Stay away from that guy. Boop, 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 boop. Okay? So the credibility is established in the first year of the congresses, because we had Joseph Rizzo from Harvard Medical School as the co-organizer of the Eye and the Chip, one of the leading neuro-ophthalmologists in the world. And when we did the next year on the eye, the brain, and the auto, or the eye and the auto, we had Cynthia Owsley.
Wow. And how did you keep, I mean, over the years, how do you view keeping a community together, right? Because forces will come in, people will get their bright ideas, people will want to use something like this, like a platform or something else. But it seems like you've been able to keep the integrity of the process. Say a word about that.
We've made some mistakes, but they haven't been common. One of the ways is there's a danger in reading over the literature of someone that you're pretty sure you want and finding out that there always seems to be a marketing twist in this guy's work. Okay, and that's lethal. But the other side of it is that very often the people we're really interested in are in the level of their department or their corporation, which does not allow them the travel funds to stay 3 days at a meeting. And so from the very first, if we settle on a guy, we pay his way. If his department won't pay it, Roseanne and the rest of us will figure out a way to put together the money to bring that person in and to make a presentation and to have their air travel and their 3 days in the hotel covered.
So not only are you identifying those adjacencies of people that you say really should be here, but once you've said that person really belongs in this discussion, you're making it possible for them to be there.
That's absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have Joanne Wood coming. I can remember when Joanne Wood, who is a researcher in Australia, when she was in the, I wouldn't be so gross to call her a nobody, but I think the first time we invited Joanne Wood, nobody knew who she was. Now she is she's one of the leading lights of the eye and the auto, and I would guess that she's so far up now in the academic realm that she probably could pay her own way, but we make sure she's here. But
it's still there. You get her there either way. That's awesome. Well, I want to mention to our audience, if they've got a question for Dr. Hessburg, we would welcome it. Feel free to raise a hand in the Zoom room. I do want to, before we get too close to the end here, I do want to bring up, and thank you to Roseanne Horn, who's in studio but off camera here with us today, and it's the power behind the throne, certainly putting all these things together.
no,
Doctor,
she actually sits on the throne.
She actually sits on the throne. I was starting to wonder if that weren't the case.
True.
That's awesome. Thank you, Roseanne. And we have this slide here of the upcoming events. Maybe, Dr. Hessburg, you can say a word about the two events again that are coming up. Just held October 30th through November 1st was the Eye, the Brain, and the Auto. Presumably that's coming up again next year, the same.
Will come again in 2024.
That's 2024,
Yeah, right.
and the Eye and the Chip is 2023.
Yes, it is. Right.
Who are we looking for that event on October 8th through 10th for the Eye and the Chip?
Well, certainly we will have in the room virtually everybody who in the world who's making a contribution in this field. And so that attracts not only people who are thinking about the day when they will begin to implant these, because right now we're not at the place where around the world we've probably put in 500 devices. So the proof of principle is very solid, but it isn't at the place where every neurosurgeon is opening up the skull to put in these devices. That's in the offing. But we'll have other tinkerers who are working on them, other representatives for corporations that are currently manufacturing them. There will be patent attorneys there. There will be entrepreneurs there. There will be representatives of the blind community there. and it's open. The microphones are spread through the audience, so anybody in the audience is invited to speak.
That's
and
amazing.
that long challenge period of 10 minutes is unusual in a medical meeting. That's a long time to defend yourself.
Yeah, I mean, if you already got through your PhD thesis a long time ago, this is resubjecting yourself to a little bit more of the same.
You better know where the problems are going to come from.
Where it's coming from. If people want to get connected, they can go to www.henryford.com and either / the eye and the auto, all one word, or / the eye and the chip, all one word. Or at the bottom of the slide, which I think is full screen now, you can see Roseanne's email if you want to get connected to that. I guess one more question here, Dr. Hessburg. You said over 500 of these devices have been implanted in this community. That's a relative.
But the world community.
The world community.
Not this little community.
The world
right.
neuroprocessing community.
Yeah, right.
What does it take? I mean, this is a big decision to allow someone to operate on you experimentally at some level.
Sure.
To do that. Just take us through a little bit of that process. What is somebody? Who are the people who willingly go through these kinds of operations, knowing that this is still research grade? I mean, it's one thing to adopt, people for a clinical trial if it's a foot brace.
First of all, if someone is blind from birth, the brain has never learned to see, and so one of these devices would not produce any useful vision whatsoever.
Interesting.
If the patient has developed good vision, such as patients who have retinitis pigmentosa, if they start losing their vision in their late teens, and generally they're pretty fully blind by the time they're in their 40s, those patients either have a strong desire to see again, or they become so adept at the niceties of life without vision that they really could care less about devices. So they tend to sort themselves out between those people who truly want a device and those people who say, hey, I'm getting along fine the way I am. At the Detroit Institute of Ophthalmology, we run probably the largest support groups for people who are blind or visually impaired in the United States. And so we know a good deal about the people who are appropriate candidates. Appropriate candidates for a dog, for instance. Leader dogs, they're not for everybody. A leader dog takes a lot of doing. And so a lot of people, we've got blind people in our support groups who couldn't care less about a dog because they've learned to stick walk so well or to get along so well that they don't want to be bothered with a dog. And those people generally say, why do I want to go all through this for a chip to give me a vision which isn't perfect vision? So the patients themselves, when we don't do any of the implanting at the Detroit Institute of Ophthalmology, we're a pretty neutral body. So we don't have a dog in the fight, but I know all of the people who do, and they're very, very careful to lay out, this is what you can expect, and we don't think you're a good candidate, or we think you are a good candidate.
Such a big decision, and like you said, I mean, I've a dear friend of mine is blind, and when you're with her, you realize how much not only coping mechanism, but how much excelling someone does when they don't have access to that faculty. They tune so many other senses to be functional. So it's kind of amazing to watch that process.
How long has she been blind?
I believe in that case since birth.
Since birth?
Yeah.
I have a blind grandson, and he's been blind since birth, but watch him get around in his family's tri-level home. I'm astounded. He flies around that house and up and down those stairs. I stumble around there. I don't know where the heck I'm going. And Philip, his name is Philip too, will fly around that house. He'll fly around the house into the kitchen and unerringly put his hand on the cold water faucet.
Wow.
You know, it's amazing.
I can see, and I can't do it that fast, right?
Right.
That's awesome. Well, this is all it's amazing. I think it's so cool how this isn't just sort of pie in the sky stuff. This is stuff that's being done right now. One more personal anecdote, some more dear friends of ours, going back to the eye, the brain, and the auto,
Sure.
lost their mom in a car crash when the driver of the other vehicle basically went into rigor mortis after a heart attack. And of course, the
Sure.
visual screening that they went through didn't save that. And so the
No.
kind of thing that you're working on, this is not pie in the sky stuff.
What should happen? This is
Yeah.
this is very interesting.
Yeah.
6 or 8 years ago at the Eye, the Brain, and the Auto, a bunch of people got together and said, what should the car do? The car should pull off the road. Okay, that's fine. The car will pull off the road. Then at the Eye, the Brain, and the Auto 4 years ago, the same people standing out in the hall say, no, the car ought to call 911 and get somebody there who can help. Okay, for the past 2 issues of the Eye, the Brain, and the Auto, there's no question about it. The car ought to take over, discern what the driver's problem is, and then take that vehicle to a healthcare facility geared up to handle that malady. You can't take somebody who's having that kind of a heart attack to a CVS health hardware store. Okay, if the patient has that kind of a massive coronary event, they've got to go somewhere that can handle it.
And this is also something that I think is people might say, well, how often does that happen? But in our own family, we experienced something where we ended up in an emergency room that was not equipped to handle the problem. We had to do a transport 30 minutes across town, losing precious time
Sure.
to get the care that we needed. So that's again, hits right at home. Yeah.
That's why, in effect, when you look at Timo Turvo's studies of mortalities in Finland, so much of this comes out. Why we handle this thing well or why we handle it badly. But he had terrible time getting it started in Finland. Everybody said, what's this ophthalmologist doing this for? Now, of course, he's a national hero. He's won the Bartimaeus Award. But some of this is not easy sledding.
Yeah, well, it's amazing what you're doing. I love, as I said at the beginning, I love how you could have just turned the crank for your career, but you allowed the questions to sort of ask themselves. Now you find yourself at this nexus of so many things that are coming together at this point in history. I mean, really, truly. So I think we can encourage folks, if you're into vision and vision processing, coming up October 8th through 10th of 2023, the eye and the chip, and then in 2024, coming back around to the eye, the brain, and the auto.
That's right.
And wow, what a fertile ground. We all know that all sorts of things are going to happen here, and you guys are at the center of talking about it and trying to do things about it.
It's been an honor being with you.
I thank you for your time today, Dr. Hessburg. We appreciate you.
Good.
Well, that's it for MedTech Crossroads today. We're so thankful to have you with us. If you want to see this, it'll be both part of the full show and also as a separate interview with Dr. Hessburg on YouTube afterwards. We're looking forward to seeing you next week. Happy December. It's great to be in December here in Michigan, but hey, we love it. We love the 4 seasons. Thanks for being with us today.